The clue's in the title, really. An orphanage. People assume that it's full of orphans, but roughly 4 out of every 5 children in an orphanage have a living parent. So they're not orphans, but we still use the term orphanage, even though many countries around the world have really painful pasts when they look back at orphanages. They've shifted away in the latter half of the 20th century away from that form of care because we know that separating children from their families and growing up in institutional care causes terrible outcomes for children. And so countries like the UK, Australia, Canada, the US made really intentional shifts away from that model of care. Children who grow up in institutions, research evidence shows that your cognitive, physical, emotional development are harmed, particularly younger children. And for younger children, it can be difficult to reverse that trajectory. Taking a child out of a loving family and a supported community and placing them behind walls does expose them to forms of abuse that's harder to identify. And so we see increased risk of abuse and trafficking for children placed in institutions.
Well, my background is working in child trafficking and trying to end child exploitation, and I've done that for over a decade now. And so I'm motivated really by working with young people who have experienced horrific forms of abuse and being inspired by the way that they can turn their lives around and show such great resilience. And with Lumos, I feel that Lumos has a cause that is just so important. Human trafficking and child trafficking in particular is where children can be recruited or kept in a place for the purpose of exploitation. So we know that orphanages, or so-called orphanages, and trafficking interact in many ways. We see children being trafficked into orphanages, sometimes for financial gain, but also for other forms of exploitation, such as sexual or forced labour. But we also see children being trafficked out of them and sold onwards, often for illegal adoption. So in that sense, institutional care and orphanages can act as both a driver of family separation, but also trafficking can be a consequence of that. And so there's just a really high risk of abuse and exploitation in institutional care, which is one of the main reasons why we need to reform this system. We also see additional forms of exploitation taking place where children are forced to perform for volunteers. They're deliberately kept out of education so that they could be there when visitors come. They're sometimes groomed to say that they're orphans and to not talk about their family even if they have one. And they're also sometimes forced to perform either sort of cultural dances or to wear certain clothes or to even make trinkets that they can then sell to the visitors. And these are all forms of exploitation. The evidence has shown that the regular turnover and flow of mainly unskilled volunteers going into and out of orphanages is having a harmful effect on children, particularly in terms of their development and attachment. And if you imagine it from the perspective of the child in the orphanage, and you have someone coming and going, a different person maybe each week, each month, and you grow an attachment to that person, you become close to them, you form a bond, but then they leave. And then you think about that happening over a period of months, years even, and try and think about what that actually does to a child's development. We're keen to point out that not all orphanages traffic children, but what we do say categorically is that all children in orphanages are at a higher risk of exploitation.
The alternative is pretty simple, really, because it's what most of us take for granted. It's how do we keep children in families? And that's a whole host of different things. Sometimes it's about somewhere like Haiti, where often it's just trying to get kids into education. That's one of the reasons why children are separated from their families. So you can help with school fees. It could be around health access. It could be basic things like parenting programs. But when you look at the whole range and the spectrum of things that you can do to support families, it's huge, it's vast, and that requires really specific planning to what the assets are in a country and what the needs are and what the drivers of family separation. So if I was writing a cheque to support vulnerable children in another country, I guess the first question I would ask is, what happens after my money goes? Because I would want some kind of sustainable difference in that particular country. And that's one thing about the orphanage model is really once your cheque is spent, the next request is for another one and another one, because you're not doing anything sustainable in the country. So I would always look to how you tackle some of those problems with a view to sustainability in the future. I'd also do some research. I'd want to know what policies these kind of organisations have that you give money to, how are children, local communities consulted and involved in that work. Children who grow up in orphanages are often among the most voiceless and forgotten group of children in the world. But some children who grow up in orphanages have never chosen anything in their life, the clothes they wear, the food they eat. So for us to start to imagine and start to design what a system of care can look like that gives them a better life, how on earth could we not give them a role, an active role, a central role in helping to design that? It's absolutely essential. There's a legitimacy, a credibility, a skill and an expertise that people who've grown up in orphanages have. I think another really key lesson that we need to learn over the last 10 years in Haiti is to work together. There's a huge fragmentation of support and resource in Haiti, and looking particularly at the child protection system, that goes into loads of small, here's my project that looks at X, here's my project that looks at Y, here's my orphanage that's funded here and there. And they never work together, or it's rare that they work together. And to tackle what is becoming a long-term chronic humanitarian crisis, there needs to be much better planning across civil society organisations and need to work much closer with government. It's easy to work completely in silo in this area, and sometimes it's quicker in the short term. But in order for us to make the kind of leaps that we need to make for the child care and protection system in the country, there has to be partnership built in, and that has to be with government rather than operating on the margins. And people often say, well, it's really frustrating and I don't want to work with this government or that government because they're corrupt or so forth. But if you always just ignore the body, the authorities that's responsible for delivering long-term sustainable care in the country, then you'll just start to create weird parallel systems that end up fighting against the government, and you'll never take that leap. It takes longer, it can be more frustrating, but you take away the democracy in a country if you start to circumvent its government.
We want to start a conversation. We're encouraging young people to start a debate online, particularly on social media, using the hashtag #HelpingNotHelping. One of the main calls to action for the Helping Not Helping campaign is for educational establishments and businesses to adopt a policy against orphanage tourism and volunteering. Because we've done some research in the UK, for example, that suggests that the majority of young people who have visited or volunteered in an orphanage, their trip has been arranged for them by someone else, and it's often an educational body that's done so. And also many young people are doing this because they feel it will help enhance their CV and their university applications. So we need the universities to take a strong stand. It won't change just by individuals alone. We've had a number of national governments introduce travel advice, official advice and guidance for their citizens around volunteering and visiting orphanages, and a warning of the harms of doing so. And we want that to all of the countries across the world to have that, because only then will that help send out a strong message to citizens, to young people, that this is not acceptable and it's actually doing more harm than good. And if you look at the root causes of why children are separated from their families, try and look at projects that tackle these, and also go through reputable volunteering organisations. We want volunteers to still go and help children, but to do it in a way that genuinely does help. One of the sort of core messages of the campaign is don't just think you're helping, know you are. And I think it's often easy to take a small action and to not really consider the longer term implications. And orphanage tourism is certainly one of those issues. And it's been a rite of passage for young people for decades to go and visit and volunteer in orphanages. And the job now is that we have to educate about the harms